if you are foolish enough to live in London, like I am, over the last few months, you've probably noticed a blanket advertising campaign by a company called Randox. Where do I know that name from? Who are those guys again? Extend your life, and other utopian messages from the good people at Randox. And if, like me, you've been forced to return to the petrified realm of central London, then you've probably noticed that Randox have opened a number of health centres in rather expensive locations around the city in the West End. So the Extend Your Life advertising campaign, it's basically an advert to get a blood test at your local Randox centre. And it only costs you £295. Thank you so much, Randox, for allowing us the opportunity to get what is essentially a basic healthcare provision for around £300. If only I could get that for free somewhere on some sort of nationalised health service, but I can't, all right? It's impossible. I'm sometimes tempted to ring my local GP actually and just say, look, I don't have anything wrong with me, but it's been many, many years and I just quite like to see a doctor. Is that possible? Can I see a doctor? Just for once in my life. You know, I've heard so many great things about these people. It'd be really nice to see one in the flesh one day. Anyway, so Randox, the moderately successful pre-pandemic health and toxicology company, now appears to be an incredibly large and successful company which can afford blanket advertising campaigns and health centres on major high streets. So you may know Randox from the multiple scandals around COVID-19 contracts involving Matt Hancock when he was health secretary and Boris Johnson's government. In February 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic swept towards the UK, a senior employee of the healthcare firm Randox addressed an audience of horse racing royalty gathered amid the neoclassical splendour of St George's Hall in Liverpool, as Randox just so happened to be sponsoring the Grand National of that year, the Grand National that sadly never was. The unnamed senior employee told the rather indifferent crowd, remember this was February 2020 and nobody cared about COVID-19 at that point because it seemed to only affect touchy-feely people like Italians and also inexplicably the Chinese. Anyway, he told the crowd that Randox had developed a test for COVID-19, which was good because the UK had flat out refused to stock up on tests up until that point, which, as you probably know, resulted in community testing being withdrawn in March for many months, leading to nobody having any idea whether they had COVID-19 until they were on the point of being hospitalised, and elderly patients being sent into old people's homes without being tested, even though they've come straight from a hospital riddled with the virus. Anywho, back to the article. So, within a year, Britain's pandemic response and Randox's role in it would be a matter of public scrutiny, not least due to the company being named in a lobbying scandal involving the Conservative MP Owen Paterson. Now, this particular scandal was sandwiched between so many other scandals that you'd be forgiven for forgetting that Paterson was actually forced to resign after it was revealed that in 2015, Paterson took up a £100,000 a year paid role with Randox and then proceeded to lobby his fellow ministers on the company's behalf.
I've got a brilliant new strategy, which is to make so many gaffes that nobody knows which one to concentrate on.
So they cease to be newsworthy.
They cease to be newsworthy.
So that's £100,000 on top of his parliamentary salary, of course. But it's important that MPs have second jobs because, quite frankly, they don't have that much to do. They've got a lot of time on their hands. Incidentally, Aintree, the racecourse at which the Randox-sponsored Grand National was going to be held, was chaired, at the time, by Paterson's wife. Now, the article makes clear there is no suggestion that this relationship affected the sponsorship deal. There is no suggestion of that. Who would suggest that, I think, is a bigger question. Although when you think about it, actually, that's probably fair because if the racecourse hadn't been chaired by Paterson's wife, it would probably have been the wife of a colleague of Paterson's, or someone he went to school with, or someone from the club, or whatever. Before the pandemic, back in the day, Randox had got into a bit of bother when the criminal convictions of 41 people who had pleaded guilty to drug driving were quashed and a further 50 investigations were dropped after an investigation into alleged data tampering at a Randox forensics lab. The National Police Chief's Council forensic lead at the time described the scandal as the biggest breach of integrity in forensic science in living memory. And yet, despite Randox's poor record, the company was given a huge contract by the government at the beginning of the pandemic, failed to deliver on that contract, and then was given a second contract, which all in all amounted to around £500 million.
30th of March. U-turning on the decision to abandon mass testing, the government awards a £133 million contract unopposed in a closed process to private healthcare company Randox to provide COVID-19 test kits. The company employs Conservative MP Owen Paterson as a £100,000 a year consultant. 8th of August. 750,000 test kits sent to care homes and individuals are recalled by Tory-linked health firm Randox after they're found to be substandard and potentially contaminated.
Now, in February 2022, the government was forced to publish documents that revealed how Paterson directly lobbied Hancock in the early stages of the COVID pandemic, saying amongst other things that he was exacerbated, the government was slow to respond to Randox's offer to help. And in April 2022, just a few months ago, it was revealed that in 2019, the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock was given an overnight stay at a country estate owned by the head of Randox. The original Guardian article that I quoted suggests that before the pandemic, Randox was making sales, not profits, just sales, of around 100 million a year. Now, if you give a company of that size contracts worth a combined total of 480 million, then you've basically bought out the company, haven't you? I mean, you're clearly not paying Randox to use their already existing infrastructure and capacity. You are paying them to grow in order to meet your requirements. You're basically paying for a small company to become an incredibly large one. Something that was apparently not possible to do through the NHS.
I do indeed congratulate Randox and all the other businesses involved, and we are massively expanding testing the whole time.
When borders began opening up and international travel began to return, governments around the world demanded that travellers take a COVID test before arriving. And overnight, an industry was born. Leading the way in this new world was Randox, which had now begun opening high street facilities in which one could purchase tests. Now, no one is suggesting that the tests people were paying for at Randox health centres were the same tests that had been subsidised by the government's contracts. No one's suggesting that. Who would suggest that? Equally, no one is suggesting that Randox's brand new health centres that popped up all over London and other cities in the UK were funded with COVID contract money. And no one's suggesting that the big advertising campaigns now that you see all over the tube that they were paid for through the government contracts. No one's suggesting that. And certainly not this channel, because this channel is just a comedy channel. We just make comical observations here at Complaints on a Plate. Sometimes we'll be talking about, what's the deal with plain food? Delightful observations like that. Other times we'll be talking about, isn't it funny how companies like Randox were given huge contracts during the COVID-19 pandemic while the NHS still suffers? Just observational comedy like that. Why is airline food so tasteless? Have you ever wondered why? Anybody? No? Yeah? Well, I'll tell you. Because it's plain food. It's plain food. If you like this comedy channel, by the way, why don't you like the video and subscribe to the channel? I'm sure almost all of the £500 million that was given to Randox has been spent on supporting the NHS and fighting the pandemic. And it just so happens that on the side of that, Randox happened to make a lot of money, or were able to convince banks to give them massive loans to expand their company totally separately to the government contracts. But it would be interesting, if you do give a small company like Randox £500 million and they fail in basically the main thing that they were supposed to do. It would be, I think it would be quite a good idea to allow public scrutiny of how that money was spent. It's also a shame now that we're living in a time when we've got a lot of inflation going on, and the government claiming that they can't spend too much money these days because they spent so much money fighting the pandemic by giving out these very, very large contracts to private companies. And they did a bang-up job. I mean, we got through the pandemic, Britain still exists. So you can't deny that we got through the pandemic. It didn't, sink into the sea. No, I don't buy into the argument that because a lot of money was spent during the pandemic, no money can be spent now. But if you do buy into that argument, then at the very least, surely it's worth scrutinising how that money was spent. Because just saying that it was spent to help the pandemic doesn't necessarily mean that it was helpful. I could be like, well, my friend's having a really hard time dealing with lockdown and stuff, so I gave him £500 million. And, that helped him through it. When you see companies like Randox going from strength to strength, and you see a lot of people struggling considerably just to make ends meet, and of course you see the NHS, even after all this time, and all the fuss around the NHS coping and all of this kind of stuff, and you still see it absolutely on its knees, basically had no long-term funding, no sort of investment in infrastructure, still cobbled together. You got to wonder, do you think it's possible that a politician from, say an establishment party, just because that would be the best position to start from, they could possibly create a winning coalition around criticising the private finance model and pledging, or, obviously the word pledge has lost all meaning, but something promising, I don't know, just, I guess it'd have to be a trustworthy politician in the first place. But, if someone like that, comes along and builds the narrative that there is another way to run this country, I think, if someone were to do that, they'd almost certainly be very popular with a large contingent of voters and potential voters in the UK. And imagine if they did all this and weren't anti-Semitic. I mean, is that possible? Sometimes I wonder. Again, just a comical observation. Made by a comedy channel. It's plain food, isn't it? It's plain food. It's plain food. It's plain food. Thank you very much, everybody that subscribes to this channel, and thank you even more so to those that are Patreons. If you'd like to join the Patreon, there's a link below.